Last week, we left off with the story of Abimelech, and I'd like to revisit that a little bit. So, way back when we were talking up front about the common ideas that are presented by ministries like, for instance, the Blue Letter Bible here about God's attributes, and that they describe his immutability as this fundamental attribute with a very broad definition that he doesn't change in any way whatsoever, including that he doesn't change his mind. And we talked a lot about how the Bible describes him changing his mind all the time. But also it says his plan or his prophecies never change. And so I don't really think I highlighted that last week when we were talking about Abimelech, about that there is a prophecy in there that changes. So what is a prophecy? I've got the Wikipedia entry here. This is a pretty good definition. It says that a prophecy is a message that has been communicated to a person by a supernatural entity, and that the word comes from a Greek word that means the gift of interpreting the will of God. So it's some communication of God's will. And so someone who's communicating God's will today doesn't necessarily have a special revelation, but they could still be said to be giving a prophetic word. And something that's not covered here that would normally be covered in the definition of prophecy. And it's really what the etymology of the word comes from. It's got the word pro, which means before, and then the root word has to do with saying. So it's really like foretelling, but it's not limited to like necessarily telling the future, but you could call it a prophecy when God says something is going to happen, whether or not it's his plan to do it, or if it's just something that's going to happen because of things that he knows about other people's plans. Now, if you're of a Calvinist persuasion, you would say that there's no distinction between the two because everything that everyone does is planned out and meticulously controlled by God, and that his plan doesn't change. But as we're sort of thinking like in more normal terms of how we think about someone, like if I say about the future that I'm going to be in Ohio today at 4 o'clock, that's because I have plans to go to Ohio at 4 o'clock, and it's very likely that it's going to be. But other things I could say about the future are based on my knowledge that don't even have anything to do with me. Like if you just, if you're speaking about things external to yourself, and that's not really laid out in this definition, but it would include that. But for the sake of what we're about to talk about, we're talking about more about God's plan, like something he says he's going to do, but then doesn't do. And so when God came to Abimelech in a dream, this is a prophetic dream, right? God is communicating to a man through his dream. And he says, indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. So God's communicating his intention to kill Abimelech. Now, he could have just killed him, right? So you could say, just like with Nineveh, why did God want a prophet to tell the Ninevites that they were going to be destroyed in 40 days? Well, he didn't say, but they responded by, hopefully if we repent, he won't do this. And then he didn't. And Jonah knew that that's the kind of God he is. He's the kind of God who repents from doing harm. And that's why he didn't want to take them the message to begin with, because he wanted them to be destroyed. He's not very nice, right? So indeed, you are a dead man. Like he's not presenting this as a conditional thing, but why did he tell him to begin with? And then when Abimelech responds and says, I didn't know, I wouldn't have done this if I had known, and God lets him live. So the statement, indeed, you are a dead man, didn't come to pass. And so that's the prophecy, the plan that changed. So he softens it a bit and says, God says, but if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die. So there's still that threat, right? Yeah, okay, I'm not going to kill you, but you got to send this woman back to her husband or else you will die. But, that's a lot better.
He did the same thing with Adam and Eve. He said, if
right.
you eat from this, you will surely die.
Yeah. So he had a plan and he changed his plan. And the plan was communicated to man, which makes it a prophecy, and it still changed. So the idea that is presented, in that Blue Letter Bible and by Christian ministries broadly, that God's plans never change, they're very sure, that's not what we see. I mean, we're only 20 chapters into the Bible, and we're, like you said, even on page 3, there's a major change in plan. In contrast to the way that story is presented, if you recall when we were talking about John Calvin, he says that Proverbs 21, verse 1, that the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes. John Calvin interpreted that to mean that if that applies to kings, then it must apply to the whole human race. And so whatever we conceive in our minds is directed by the secret inspiration of God. And at the time, I pointed out that another plain reading of this text could be applied to something like Pharaoh, where Pharaoh had his will, God had his will, and they were opposed. And God made Pharaoh's will bend to his will by doing things to him, right? It didn't start out that way. And in this case, you have with Abimelech, God didn't have to go to the extreme efforts that he did with Pharaoh. And in fact, even when he threatened to kill him, based on Abimelech's response, he probably came on stronger than he even needed to. It seems like if Abimelech had known that this woman was married, he wouldn't have taken her.
I think there was a reprieve, let's call it a reprieve maybe, because he didn't know.
Right.
So,
Yeah. But the threats still say like, but if you don't, if you're just blowing smoke and you're still going to follow through with her, you will die. Right.
Because then he had the knowledge.
Right.
So then he would be.
Sure. But it wasn't like Abimelech could have just talked his way out of it and then continued to do what he was intending to do. The threat was still there, but it wasn't, I'm going to kill you, that was the opening statement. There wasn't even an explanation that it was optional, right?
Did God know that Abimelech didn't know?
The text doesn't say. So we can only speculate on that. Mm-hmm. But either way, you could call it a testing, because when presented with this knowledge, how do you respond? Of course, he seemed to come in pretty strong. Like, he didn't seem as concerned with testing Abimelech as just fixing the situation. And so he seemed fully prepared to just kill Abimelech. But Abimelech's protests moved him to, I don't need to kill this guy. He didn't even do anything wrong yet. And then I like to point out, we talked about it last time, we talked about this verse with John Calvin, that the very next verse after his proof text contradicts his interpretation of the proof text. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts. And so John Calvin thinks that the way of the man is put there by God, but this is drawing a contrast between the way men think and what they do based on their wills, and that God weighs their hearts. He wouldn't have any reason to weigh their hearts if what was in their hearts was coming from him to begin with. So this interpretation that John Calvin applies, that if God can steer the will of kings, then he must be, everyone's desires, everyone's intentions are all coming from God. This seems more likely to be describing like what we saw with Abimelech. God forces his will on people just by, in this case, a threat, right? Like, if everyone's desire comes from God, why did he have to go through all that business with the whale eating Jonah? If he's controlling Jonah's will directly, Jonah would have wanted to go to Nineveh to begin with. But why would God make Jonah want to go this way and then force him to go the other way through external coercion? So God can coerce people, but it's more from external things like, I'll kill you if you don't do what I want you to do, things like that.
Or just take a caravan. It's only 140 miles. In other words, why have him go inside of a fish and go all the way around Africa?
Well, what about the word obedience? Was he not obedient, Noah? I mean,
Jonah? No, he wasn't.
No, he
Right?
wasn't.
So
God said,
He was told to go to Nineveh.
He wanted them to be destroyed.
he got to take the scenic route then.
yeah, but like,
He never saw any of it. He just
The inside of the fish was a little pit.
but if you're a Calvinist,
Oh,
you would think that Jonah's will was sourced from God, that his will to go to Tarshish was God's put that desire in his heart. So God made him want to go to do the opposite of what he said. That's that thing with the secret will and the revealed will, or the decretive will versus the prescriptive will, like what he says versus what he's actually doing. They don't want to say that anything that can happen is outside of God's will. So whatever happens, that must be what God willed, right? But that's not what we're seeing like with the scripture. I mean, I think it's nonsensical. Like, it doesn't make sense to have God say, I want you to go to Nineveh, and then make him want to go over here, and then coerce him with a whale to, it's strange, right? But that's the presupposition that God can't change, that everything that happens according to God's perfect will lead you to that kind of thinking. But here, Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. That would apply plainly to the Abimelech story. The king was doing what he wanted to do, and God intervened, and now the king's will was different than it was at the start. He's more powerful than these kings who normally get their way. And so I just kind of wanted to go over a distinction between these two viewpoints. The classical viewpoint of God's knowledge or his omniscience is that it's complete and maximal. So everything that God will ever know, he already knows. There's nothing to be learned. He can't learn anything. There's nothing to learn. And that it's unfalsifiable. So the things that God knows are going to be true. And so if he knows that something is going to happen, it will happen. There's no other option. So the future is utterly settled, and God can never have an expectation that isn't realized. And it's innate, it's ingenerate, it's ungenerated, it's not acquired from outside of himself. It's sort of automatic. Like he just has this knowledge and it's complete and perfect and maximal, and things will never come to pass in a way that's different than what he expected. And it doesn't come from anywhere. It's just a part of his being, and that it's non-dependent. So it doesn't come from anything outside of himself. And that it's nondiscursive. That it's like the word discourse, like when you're conversing with someone, or it can be with yourself too. This is the idea of one thought leading to another, and it has to do with thinking and reasoning. So if you think about, for instance, if you're playing chess, the better you are at chess, the better you are at doing this. But when you think, well, if I do this, then my opponent will do that, and you're thinking multiple moves ahead. And you could say, the grandmaster chess person might say, it'll be checkmate in 5 moves. And then it'll happen, right? Not because they're controlling the entire universe, but because they understand their opponent, then they know that they're going to lead them into this. And so that's discursive knowledge. They have knowledge of how this game is going to play out because they've reasoned through it. But according to classical theism, God doesn't have that kind of knowledge. He doesn't think. He just knows. He already knows. There's no one thought leading to another and coming to a conclusion. And in contrast, biblical theism, how God is described in the Bible is that God knows things because he sees. So God brought the animals to Adam to see what he would call them, to find out, right? By observing. He searches. In Psalm 139, for instance, David describes God searching his heart. We see that language a lot throughout the Bible, which is a little more maybe intentional than just seeing, but actually like kind of seeking things out. And through testing, which we're going to see an example of that in a minute.
Would a classical theist say, well, God already named the animals, he didn't
Yes.
name?
Adam named them exactly what God planned he would name them. That's what they would say,
Oh.
right?
God told him what to say.
Yeah, everything that Adam's doing is part of his eternal decree, and that he already knows everything that will happen. So they'll actually say he can't learn things. He can't think, because everything that he will ever know, he already knows. And then finally, God knows things because he does them. So think of a billiard player, 8-ball corner pocket, and then it happens. It's because he's competent and he makes it happen. So a lot of prophecies are God saying what he will do and then doing them. He says, I will do it, and then he does it. And those are subject to change too, because his intentions change if the circumstances change. And he lays that out too, right? I'm always talking about Jeremiah 18 with the potter and the clay, where he says he's going to bless a nation, but that nation turns to wickedness, and he repents from what he thought he would do, right? Not just what he said he would do, but what he thought he would do. And same thing with Nineveh, right? Like, I'm going to destroy this nation, but then they repent, and he is happy to change his mind and grant mercy. And we also saw with Abraham talking to God about what's the acceptable amount of collateral damage when you destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And they were, talking down from 50 down to 5. But he was saying, well, yeah, if there's 50 there, I'll spare the whole city for the sake of those 50. But that wasn't his intention before he was questioned about it from Abraham. And it didn't ultimately happen, because it turns out there were only about 3.5. What's that?
So few that were there.
Yeah, so those four got out. Lot's wife didn't make it all the way, but and then God is great in wisdom and understanding, and that's where he can know things even external to what he does. He can anticipate what others will do because of his ability to think and reason, just like that chess player. Like he's not making the opponent go where they want. They're freely choosing, but they're choosing something based on their options and what was expedient to them, and he can anticipate that. So a combination of his potency, his competence, and his knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, he can know a great deal about the future, but it's not the sort of knowledge that the classical theists would have, is that it's already set just the way the past is set. Like it's going to happen one certain way, right? And so even as people, we talk about knowing things about the future, right? But we don't have this exhaustive control or knowledge of everything about the future, but we still know we have expectations that probably a lot of you, most certainly me, where will you be in 1 week from this moment? I'll be sitting right here talking about
That's
the
what
Bible.
your plan is, but you
Yeah,
don't know.
I mean, it's right. But if I said that last week, I mean, I've got a pretty good track record, right? I mean, there's things that could happen. Sure, it's because it's not utterly set. But if someone says, I know I'm going to be at church next Sunday, like we don't go, well, you don't, what are you, omniscient? Like we don't talk that way, right? But when statements are made about God and him having knowledge of events to come, we have a tendency to assign different meaning to the same words that can be applied to people. Probably along the way, not today necessarily, but we'll look at some examples of these things about people knowing the future. Like that kind of language is used for people in the Bible too. Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on Genesis 22 because we covered it at length a few months ago, but this is an example. I said, one of the ways that God knows things is through testing. And Genesis 22 is presented explicitly as a test of Abraham. It says, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. And then we know the story that when he's about to slay his son, that the angel stops him and God says, do not lay a hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. And so I remember a few months ago, you said, well, isn't it really Abraham who knows? And it's like, that's not what the text says,
Yeah.
but he knew Abraham. But this is like another level. Like you have a hypothesis and then you test the hypothesis to confirm it, right? So it's strengthening your knowledge. And sometimes you don't get the result that you expected through the testing. But in this case,
I test you all the time.
oh yeah.
Does he pass?
I know he's a great husband, but I still test him.
We'll jump quite a bit ahead here in Genesis to the story of Joseph. You don't get a lot of the determinism proof texts in Genesis, except maybe one here late in Genesis dealing with Joseph. Genesis 37 opens up with Joseph being 17 years old, and it calls him a lad in here, just to point out in the previous passage in Genesis 22, it uses the same word for Isaac, that he was a lad. And I think when we were talking about, how old is that? And it's not a little kid, right? So here we're actually given an age, 17. So 17 is in the range of someone that could be called a lad. It's a young man, an older teenager, sometimes they're called youths, but we're not talking about a real little kid. This is somebody who's at or close to adulthood. So anyway, just as a point of interest, this gives a little context for, what that word lad, it's the same Hebrew word here. And here he's 17 years old. So Joseph basically tattles on some of his brothers that Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. So they didn't like that, right? Like no one likes a tattletale, right? And then Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. So he's the youngest. Well, there's also Benjamin, but he's kind of getting the special treatment. He gets the fancy coat, and it says that they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So from the start here, there's this dynamic that Joseph is the father's favorite. He's doing things that maybe endear him to his father, but are very off-putting to his brothers, telling on them and stuff like that. And they don't like him. Another reason that they hated him was he had those dreams where it had his brothers and his parents bowing to him, so he's doing all this stuff that they decided they wanted to kill him. They want to kill him. Reuben decided, well, what if we just put him in this pit and leave him for dead? But secretly he was thinking, well, I'll come back later and save him. He wasn't in on this plot, but instead of trying to talk his brothers out of it, he just thought, well, I'll just play along, but try to steer it so I can save him later. So he's in the pit. And then Judah sees this caravan of Ishmaelites going by, these traders, and thinks, well, what if we just sold him to them? And then he'll be out of our lives. We'll get some money. We won't have a body to hide. It kind of would work out better for all of us. There'll be less guilt, but they like that idea. So they sell him to the traders. The traders take him to Egypt, and he ends up being in prison. And then he interprets these dreams for the Pharaoh. Now, the dreams came from God, and Joseph was able to interpret them.
When they went back to their father, what did they say? Where's Joseph?
They took his cloak, put animal blood on it, so they made it look like he was dead. And like, oh, we don't know what happened. Looks like he was killed by animals. And, we found his coat and it's all bloody. He's in Egypt then. He's interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams. And the dream was that there would have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And Joseph says that this is telling us what God is about to do. So this is something where God knows the future because he's going to bring it about. And that the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because this is established by God and God will shortly bring it to pass. And I think another way of saying that is like, this isn't something where like, maybe if we pray, he'll change his mind about it. The repetition kind of reinforces that this is a sure thing. And that those 7 years of plenty can be used then to prepare for the famine afterwards. So the dream, it's not like maybe this won't happen. It is going to happen. So prepare. And they do. And they have all the food stored up. And then Jacob sends his sons to buy food from them, right? And so Joseph, there's the whole story where he doesn't reveal who he is and stuff. And then he finally does. And he says to his brothers, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. So because he was in Egypt and he was a part of this, knowing ahead of time that the famine would come, but that they would have these years of plenty beforehand, able to share that benefit here and preserve life, not only in Egypt, but for them too, right? For these 2 years, there's only 2 years into this famine, and there's 5 more coming, right? So God sent me before you to preserve a posterity, a remnant for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. Now that's where Calvinists will say, aha, their whole plan was actually God's plan, but their plan was to kill him, right? Their plan got modified through God's influence, which doesn't take much. I was talking to Leah about how subject to influence we are, where we'll be sitting on the TV and we're not thinking about pizza at all. And then a Domino's pizza commercial comes on, and next thing you know, like, oh, pizza, that sounds good. I want pizza. All it takes is a whisper, a nudge, or an image, right? So Reuben, his conscience being used to, have this alternate plan, and then the caravan being in an opportune place at that time, God could have arranged that. Maybe, giving Judah the thought that selling him would be advantageous to them. And so they go from plotting to kill him to selling him to Egypt, and then using his presence in Egypt, using this famine and his dreams. Now he's in a position of power in Egypt, and he's able to bring his brothers to Egypt, and they end up under Egypt's protection as they grow as a
Did he
nation.
bring the brothers brothers to Egypt, or did the
They went there
came-
looking for food.
Jacob
they were
sent
there?
them.
But he said,
Yeah.
I want to see my younger brother. And the whole
Yeah. We skipped over some of the details, but they were going to Egypt for food. And then he was questioning,
They had
saying
no idea he was even alive.
they didn't, and he didn't know who else was alive. So he's asking questions about, do you have any other brothers? And they're like, well, we had this one brother who he was killed by animals years ago. And then our younger brother, he's back home with our father. So then he arranges, he wants the younger one there and everything. So he works it so that they all end up in Egypt. Yeah.
I don't know if that was actually, if it was just different in mine, but there's a section that says, when he's talking to his brother, he says, what you guys meant to me for evil.
It's the next slide.
Oh, okay.
We got it. You're right. Yeah. Yeah. So this is, yeah. So
Right,
this,
so it's like God didn't mean it for evil. You guys meant it for
Right.
evil. Like
And
there's
this-
an evil one out there that means evil. God takes that evil and turns it for good. Just,
yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So their intention was to kill him, but they would settle for sell him to slavery. But as far as I know, he could have been killed by whoever he sold him to, right? He was as good as dead to them, right? Yeah, this is the one that is sometimes used as sort of a proof text that every evil thing that people do is actually God making them do the evil so that something good will happen, right? So he says, but as for you, this is later. So what happens here, because we jumped ahead a few chapters, right? Now Jacob has died and they're worried again because even though he had that prior conversation with them and said, it's all water under the bridge, now that their father has died, they're kind of wondering if he's going to turn on them now that dad's out of the picture, and they're troubled about this. And so he's reassuring them. He says, it's a good thing. It turned out good that I came here and that God worked it out for all of our benefit. And so he says, as for you, you meant evil against me. And that word meant, it literally means wove, like to weave fabric, to put together. So, you can say fabricated, right? Planned. So they planned evil. They had this whole plan and were working things out. Their intention was evil. Their intention was to get rid of their brother, right? But God wove it. He worked things out and put it together in order to bring it out as it is this day, to save many people alive, right? Through getting him in Egypt, getting him in a position where he had Pharaoh's ear, and giving Pharaoh this dream, having Joseph interpret it, then having the storehouses full that, gets his brothers there too. And then after this, you have the people of Israel growing up in Egypt, growing into a great many people. And that was good for them too. With Moses, then it was time for them to move on and leave, but they got to grow as a people of just a few dozen people to many thousands of people under the protection of Egypt. And so God arranged it so that they were using this pagan nation's resources to protect these people. Whereas if they were just nomads, they would have been more vulnerable to attacks and things like that.
But it was also important for the line of Jacob to continue.
Yeah. So they got to do that. They got to grow as a people in Egypt after this, right? And so here's a section from Josephus' Antiquity of the Jews. And this is effectively a 2,000-year-old commentary on the Bible, where in his history of the Jewish people, he's really paraphrasing and retelling the stories of the Bible. And there's some sort of details about, the dialogue and stuff. It's like as if he's read and knows the Bible really well and knows the traditions around them, and then he's kind of putting those into words. So it's just sort of a retelling of the story. So this is the sort of thing like when we have a movie, like what's that, Prince of Egypt, right? It's a retelling of the story. The dialogue might be different, but you're trying to convey the same message and story.
Moses.
Yeah. Oh, right. What's the
I
other
just
one?
wanted to say-
There's one about Joseph too.
Yeah, the
sequel.
prequel.
Yeah.
And I also want to say there's a movie called The Story of Joseph with Martin Landau as Jacob. And it's really an amazing movie if you ever get a chance to see it on YouTube Plus.
Okay, so here's Joseph talking to his brothers according to Josephus, how he records it. He says, I commend you for your virtue and your kindness to our brother, Benjamin. I find you better men than I could have expected from what you contrived about me. So it's like, Last I saw you guys, you were like trying to kill me and you sold me. Like, so that's the last thing he knows about this, but it was many years earlier, right? Indeed, I did all this to try your love, to test them. So he's doing this to test them, to see where their hearts are, to try your love for your brother. So I believe you were not wicked by nature in what you did in my case, right? You're not just rotten to the core because you tried to kill me. Like you're not doing that again. Because remember, his brother was like framed for theft and they didn't sell him out, right? One of the brothers, I think was it Reuben, like said, take me instead, right? They were willing to sacrifice for the sake of their brother. And knowing that if anything happened to Benjamin, it would kill their father, literally. They said, he'll die if anything
They told
happens.
us, and I think it was eating a lot of the brothers up what they had
Yeah. And this is a long time later,
Yeah.
right? But they've matured, it seems. And then he says, but that all has happened according to God's will, who has hereby procured our enjoyment of what things we will have, and if we continue in a favorable disposition of what we hope for hereafter. Since therefore I know that our Father is safe and well beyond expectation, and I see you so well disposed to your brother Benjamin, I will no longer remember what guilt you seem to have had against me. So he's saying, I'm going to forget about it. I'm not going to hold this against you that you tried to kill me and you sold me into slavery, but we'll leave off to hate. So I'm, the inclination I would have to hate you guys for that, I'm not going to have. I'm going to leave off to hate you for that wickedness and do rather return to you my thanks, for you have concurred with the intention of God to bring things to their present state, right? It wasn't what they were setting out to do, but that's how it worked out. He's in a better position than they would have been if he hadn't been sold into slavery, because now he's in this position of power and he's able to bring them all to Egypt and keep them from starving and all that. He says, I would have you also rather to forget the same. So I don't want you guys to worry about this anymore either, since that imprudence of yours is come to such a happy conclusion, than to be uneasy and blush at those your offenses. So don't keep dwelling on this. It's ancient history. I'm not going to think about it like that, and I don't want you to either, because it all worked out for the best through God's intervention. Do not, therefore, let your evil intentions, when you condemned me, and that bitter remorse which might follow, be a grief to you now, because those intentions were frustrated. And so that's the key phrase there, right? They had evil intentions, but God disrupted their intentions and brought something good about. It's not that their intentions were God's intentions. It's that they had intentions and God disrupted them, frustrated them to bring about these good things. They're two separate things. If it hadn't been for God reworking things, they just would have killed him. Go therefore your way, rejoicing in what has happened by the divine providence. So the divine providence is his intervention in steering them towards, they still thought they were getting their way. Hey, Joseph's gone, but now this good thing happened as a result.
What's the significance of Josephus' interpretation?
It's 2,000 years old, and it's an example of how Jews thought about the scriptures before the Platonism became like super mainstream among Jews. What's the guy?
Maimonides.
Maimonides. That was many centuries later. It kind of came in through Christianity.
1800s.
At this time, it was sort of fringe. You had Philo of Alexandria, but Josephus is of a more traditional mindset. He's a Pharisee. So he's got a traditional view that the scriptures are historical. And so he's kind of just retelling the story, not with the intention of like distorting it, but just sort of putting it into plain language and filling in some of the gaps that might not be in the text itself, but are a part of Jewish traditional understanding. Okay.
Whereas if Calvin had written that summary, it would have been very different.
Yes. I don't know of anything older than that. It's so thorough. Josephus's Antiquities, you've got this whole, effectively a long form commentary on the Old Testament, which is pretty neat. Not to say that it's perfect, but it does provide some insight as to their mindset and the way they understood divine providence compared to now, the idea is that whatever happens was God's
And Josephus
plan.
was a Jew, right?
Yeah.
But he was not a Christian.
No, he was not a Christian, right?
Did
Yeah.
he, it said AD 90.
90,
Is that
yeah.
when he died?
That's when he wrote.
When he wrote that, yeah.
Yeah.
So did Do you know, is there anything that shows that he actually met some of the apostles? Or-
No, but he does write about Jesus, John the Baptist, and James the Lord's brother. We covered that. I don't know if you were here.
I know that he did, but I wasn't sure if it was documented that he had actually met.
We don't know who his sources were for these things, but he was born, I think, in 37, AD 37. So he wouldn't have met Jesus. That's like a generation before him. But this stuff was still pretty fresh in their culture.
So when the Romans came to destroy the temple, it was Titus, Flavian, and Vespasian, Flavian. And the whole thing was Josephus's family, they were killed. And he let Titus adopt him. And he went right to Rome, and his goal was to tell the story of the Jewish people so that the Latins and the Greeks would not think that there were these weirdos who lived in Judea.
Yeah, so if you look at like who is his audience when he's writing the Antiquities of the Jews, it's
The Gentiles.
it's the Gentiles, giving them a readable version of their scriptures in their language. I mean, it had already been translated into Greek at this point, but he was just sort of giving them a more readable paraphrase and filling in some of these gaps as far as like how they understand these stories about different people's motivations and things like that. That is the intention. It's to familiarize people outside of Jewish culture with the Jewish understanding of history. We also have a callback to this in Acts chapter 7, which is Stephen's address, where he kind of gives this overview of the history of the Jewish people that ends with, our fathers killed the prophets who told of the coming one, and now you've killed the coming one, and you're every bit as bad as they were, because they would think, oh, we're not like those people back then that killed the prophets, right? And they ended up getting so mad that they killed him, which kind of doesn't do a lot to dispel his point. But in that address, he says, as an example, he says, and the patriarchs, becoming envious, this is talking about the brothers, right? Sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him and delivered him out of all his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over all Egypt and all his house. And you can see there's a contrast between the motivations of the brothers and God. He delivered him from these evil intentions. The intentions weren't from God. He intervened to rescue and work it for good.
But Calvinists would say that those intentions were from God.
Right.
Down to the last Adam.
Everybody's is, right? so
to the
so this
last
is another
Adam.
insight as far as, what did a believing Jew, in this case, a very early Christian, a first generation Christian, understand the story and how God's providence works in this story of Joseph. And so going back to Genesis 37 with the dream, he dreamed this dream. First, there was one about the sheaves of wheat that were the brothers bowing down to him. And then this is a second dream. And he says that the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So Jacob, his father, says, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to you before the earth? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So the question is, Jacob interprets the 11 stars to be the 11 brothers, and the sun to be him, the moon to be the mother, your mother. So did this end up happening?
Mm-hmm.
Not the mother, but.
Not the mother, right? Rachel was already dead by this point. And so you could, I think, pretty safely conclude that he was referring to Leah here, right? Because he had the mother and then the two concubines. He probably wouldn't be talking about them. But Leah didn't end up going down to Egypt. She was already dead. So,
Rachel.
no, Leah.
Oh, was she dead too?
Leah was
Oh,
dead too.
that's right.
So Rachel had died before this dream even happened. Leah ended up dying ahead of them all coming to Egypt. And so Jacob's dying wish was that he would be taken back and buried with Abraham, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. So she's already died by this point. So the whole family comes down, all the brothers, all their wives and kids, and Jacob also. Rachel had died earlier in Bethlehem and was buried there. She died giving birth to Benjamin, and they were traveling at the time. So she wasn't in the family tomb, but Leah was. And so she was already dead at this point. And so this is an example of a prophecy that came about, but it doesn't have to be in meticulous detail, right? Like Leah wasn't a part of it. That doesn't mean, oh, this prophecy didn't happen. I mean, the point of the prophecy is that Joseph was going to be in a position of power, that the rest of his family was going to be, bowing to him. The fact that the mother died before that actually happened doesn't destroy the whole thing. If you think of prophecy the way they are truly presented in the Bible as being God's plans, but not like I'm looking into the future that's already happened, where every detail is absolutely set. So the detail about Leah being around at this point didn't end up coming to pass, but it's still a valid
But
prophecy.
she was alive when he saw the dream at first.
Yeah, Leah was.
Right. So
Rachel was dead.
So it was.
It was a possibility.
At that time.
Right.
But what actually unfolded was.
She ended up dying before this plan that God had came to fruition. He knew at this point that the brothers were envious of him and were intent on killing him, and worked out this plan to get him to be in Egypt and to get into this position of power and to be able to have this food that was going to draw the others in. So that's what the dream was about, right? It doesn't matter. Like, let's say one of the other brothers had died before that. Oh, now instead of 11, it should have been 10. Like, that level of detail is not what's being communicated here. It's sort of the overall picture. And it's easy to kind of just miss that, but that's a good starting point too. So I put a few slides in there from next week with.
Then, when he gave Joseph that dream, what the brothers were gonna do to him, and that he was gonna send him to Egypt, or was?
It seems like.
Or was his plan to use Joseph? I mean, that's kind of curious too, right? Like, he knew the brothers' hearts, and he knew they were gonna sell him off, and.
Or that they were. The brothers were already envious of him and already hated him. And so it seems like this dream even sort of reinforced that hatred, sort of provoked them. And this is where now I'm going beyond what's in the text and speculating a little bit. But you already had the situation where the brothers hated Joseph. And these dreams, they're telling what God wants to happen. And they're also making his brothers hate him all the more. Like, oh, you think we're going to bow down to you, right? They don't like that. And so the ultimate end that he had in mind, apparently, was that Joseph was going to be in this position of power and it was going to be good for the nation. And that's what happened, right? It happened in spite of their hatred and their evil intentions. It wasn't that he gave them the evil intentions, but he was able to use their evil intentions to get him to be sold into Egypt and to put him in a position where he'd have the Pharaoh's ear. And even though he's in prison, now next thing you know, he's the right-hand man. It's pretty amazing. And it goes to show the different viewpoints you could have. On the one hand, everyone's a puppet and God's just doing all this stuff. But it's even more impressive if you realize that people are not puppets, that they have wills of their own, and that God's still able to use them and to steer their wills, whether good or bad, to bring about his plan, which goes back to that proverb about steering the hearts of men, right? He steered Pharaoh's heart here into giving Joseph this position of power.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So let's close it there. It's the end of Genesis.